physical processes that are actually driving the fire behavior that we observe, and we try to understand these and then develop a tool that allows us to study things like the spread rate of the fire. So just to give some examples, on the very empirical side, we might have something like the fire spread meter developed originally by MacArthur in Australia, where we can just have some basic inputs, go out and observe things like the relative humidity and the temperature and the wind speed. And from that, we're able to just get a very basic estimate of a single parameter, in this case, the spread rate. So you can see it's very straightforward to use, quite simple, and we get a very clear, direct answer immediately, essentially. Now, as we move a bit further towards the physical direction, we have something like the Rothermel fire spread model. Of course, probably the most well-known fire behavior model that we have available. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And in this case, we've added some physics in that we have an energy balance in terms of the amount of energy needed to ignite the next bit of fuel, the amount of energy released by the bit that's burning, and we close that energy balance with some empirical measurements and some empirical terms there. So we have a combination of a little bit of simplified physics and some empiricism. Then we can go even a step further in the physical direction, and we have a class of model which is often referred to as a coupled fire atmosphere model. Something like meso-NH4 fire is the example here, also war fire, ARP's canopy, and a little advertisement if you tune in 2 weeks from now for the final webinar. I believe this will be the focus more of that talk. But these particular tools have much more detail in terms of the fluid dynamics, so the simulation of the wind and the pressure over various topography. But in terms of the fire behavior, it's usually still quite simplified, parameterized model. In fact, oftentimes we're using the Rothermel fire spread model to deal with the fire aspect, and most of the detail is encapsulated in the flow simulation. But then if we go a step further and we want to increase the physics that we put more into the fire behavior side and look at the actual combustion dynamics and the kind of heat transfer that we have going on, we have the class of model that I'll refer to as a detailed physics-based fire behavior model. And so this is what I've been focused on, and what I will focus this particular webinar on is this type of model. So why have we chosen this detailed physics-based model? Well, if we look at our scale from empirical to physical, we see that we have an increasing level of detail, generally speaking. Now this means, on the one hand, we require more detail to set up and run the model. It's not as simple necessarily as taking that fire spread meter and just setting the dial to the wind speed and the temperature and that. We need a lot more information about the fuels, their structure, more detail about the topography and the weather and these kinds of things. But we also get a lot more detail out of the model. Instead of just getting this one value of spread rate, we can look at all different detailed aspects related to the combustion and the fire spread and so on. Of course, as we move from empirical to physical, again, generally speaking, we increase our computational requirements. So we're going from a case of just taking that meter in the field to running a simulation on oftentimes a supercomputer or a high-performance compute cluster, sometimes over multiple days of simulation time just to do a single simulation. So obviously, these physics-based models, they're more complicated to set up and they're more demanding to run, but they have some advantages. So hopefully the one that will stick out the most in this talk going forward is that they allow us to investigate really some of the driving mechanisms of the fire behavior by getting into some of the details that we're simulating here. So if we try to simulate something like a large wind-driven head fire versus something like a backing fire in surface fuels, then we're going to have potentially some different mechanisms that drive this fire behavior. And these models help us kind of look under the hood and try to figure out what are these mechanisms and which are most important in particular scenarios. And following on that, these models allow us to investigate a whole range of scenarios. So we might be interested in something like heat transfer from a fire if we want to look at a tree bowl in terms of fire severity and what kind of energy we're inputting into a particular tree and the potential for mortality. Or similarly, if we have firefighters, what kind of safety distance might we need given a certain heat transfer from the fire. But we could also look at something like the combustion and what sort of products it's producing in terms of smoke and how these are transported, and look more at the plume dynamics. So there's kind of a whole range of things that we can potentially do with a tool like this. And lastly, and perhaps most important, is to try to improve the simplified models that we have, because we want, at the end of the day, to have an output that's actually useful to people, that somebody can use to maybe do some operational decision making or some risk management decision making. And we don't really expect that the detailed physics-based approach is appropriate for that, but hopefully by understanding which driving mechanisms are important in a given scenario, we can try to make these simplified tools a bit more robust. Obviously, these are all kind of lofty goals that we have here. So in order to do this, we need to be sure that our physics-based model is actually working correctly. And that's really where my work is focused at the minute, is trying to understand what are the capabilities, but also the limitations and the uncertainties that we have in these models. How can we improve them going forward? So the approach that we have, and again, hopefully you were able to catch some of the previous webinars over the past couple months, but we have this multi-scaled experimental apparatus going on here. And at the largest scale we've carried out so far are these field burns on 10 by 10 meter highly instrumented plots in pine litter in New Jersey, in the Pine Barrens. And Nick and Mike and Ken have all given really nice talks about the kinds of really detailed measurements that we're making at this field scale context. But if we go a step more reduced in scale, and we want to have a little bit more control over the conditions, maybe a little bit more repeatability in terms of the fire spread that we're carrying out, we have this large-scale wind tunnel at WPI, which Albert and SK talked about in the previous seminar. And we go a step further, and some of the activities that are being carried out also here at Edinburgh include some even more simplified flame spread testing, where we're able to manipulate the structure of different fuel beds and look at how that changes the dynamics of the fire, and even going a step further to look really in detail at some of the combustion dynamics of particular fuels, the flammability, how they degrade and burn, and so on. So we have this whole suite of different measurements that are being carried out at different scales. And this is incredibly advantageous. It's been a great project from a modeler standpoint, because we have all of this information that we can use to test and interrogate something like a detailed physics-based model, where it might not be enough just to have the information from the field scale tests, even though we have done our best to instrument these really well. Sometimes we need a bit more detail in our measurements, but at the same time, it's not enough to just have the really detailed measurements from the laboratory. We need something that's at the actual scale of the problem out in the field. So having all of these different experimental setups together to try to test and improve our model has been a really nice aspect of this project. Now, before going further, I want to give a very qualitative background of what a detailed physics-based model might look like, just for those of you who might not have much familiarity with this. And I don't want to get into any kinds of equations or details of the mathematics, though I'm happy to talk about that. I don't think that's really the goal here. So I've given just some kind of qualitative examples of what we can do with this type of model. And these models are generally computational fluid dynamics models, or CFD models, if you're familiar with that sort of thing. So we're able to get a solution, a three-dimensional solution, and varying in time of different variables. For example, on the left here, we have fluid flow, where we might have air moving from left to right in this scenario, interacting with some kind of obstacle. You could think of that as a tree trunk if you want, or anything else. And we're able to investigate what kind of flow structures we have around this obstacle, things like the recirculation behind that, so we can get a nice simulation of the fluid flow. But then we can go and add in heat transfer, so we can heat up that airstream and we can look at what that does to our obstacle, how we raise the temperature of that obstacle through the convective heat transfer to it. And then we can go and also add combustion to the problem, so we can solve for the transport of a gaseous fuel, how that burns and produces smoke. And of course that's going to affect our fluid flow and our heat transfer. You see in this case that it's dramatically changed the heating that we have to that obstruction by having a fire next to it, as you would expect. And the caveat here is these all look nice. This is very idealized, but this is not virtual reality. So all of these have their limitations. That's not to say any of this is a perfect representation, but these are the kind of application spaces that we exist in with these models. These are the kinds of scenarios that you might be able to investigate. And one last thing about the details of the modeling approach. I think it's important going forward with this talk just to understand some of what I'm talking about, to understand that in order to actually solve the mathematics of the model, to get an answer, we have to divide our computational domain into this grid, this numerical grid, where we have all of these discrete grid cells. And then for each grid cell, we're getting a variable such as the temperature or the velocity of that flow or the density and so on. And then we can piece all of this together to get a three-dimensional representation of what's going on. So it's just keep in mind these discrete volumes that we're dealing with as we move forward. So all of that's nice, but there was nothing about a fuel, about vegetation, which of course we care a lot about in the wildland context. And a lot of these models were originally developed for studying fire problems in the built environment, in buildings. So we have this problem where now we want to include vegetation, and that's where a lot of our uncertainties and approximations still lie. But the approach that we take is usually to consider that it's thin fuel elements that are driving the fire spread, so your foliage or your 1-hour woody fuel. We can simulate some larger things, such as that example of kind of a mock tree bowl that I showed. But in terms of driving the fire spread, we're really looking at these fine fuel elements for now. And we assume that they're going to be on a much smaller scale than those computational grid cells I talked about. So the resolution we're able to get from our model is going to be a much larger cell than the size of a pine needle. So we have many bits of vegetation that are within each of these computational volumes. And then because it's below the scale of the model, we're not trying to solve for, say, the flow around every individual needle or that kind of thing. We're instead able to just describe the vegetation in each cell by some bulk properties. So we might have an average temperature of the vegetation, some average density, the bulk density, which helps us describe what's the proportion of solid material to gas within this grid cell, and so on. And that's not to say that we have to lump all of our fuel together like this. We could kind of layer this approach and have particular bulk properties that describe just our foliage, and then another set of bulk properties that describe our woody fuel, for example. So we can kind of increase the levels of complexity that we have here, but we're not dealing with these really individual fuel elements that are at such a small scale. We're more looking at these bulk volumes. Now I just want to mention that there are a number of tools already available or that take this kind of approach to simulating fire behavior. The one I'm using and that you'll see here is the Fire Dynamics Simulator, FDS, or you may know it as WFDS. For the purposes of this webinar, you can consider them to be the same thing. But there's also some other tools. Forest Fire Foam was something that is built off of FM Global's, again, building environment fire behavior model. But some work was done at the University of Edinburgh and also Aix-Marseille to try to develop this for wildland fire applications. We also have things like Firestar 3D or FireTech you may have heard of. So there's a number of different approaches, and similar to that sliding scale of model types, there's pros and cons to each of these. They have different capabilities. You might use one for one scenario and one might be suited a bit more to another. But generally speaking, everything under the hood in terms of the physics is similar in these or identical. And So while I am sticking with FDS just to have a consistent modeling framework throughout this project, the aim is not to pick a model and improve that model. The aim is to improve our understanding of the physics and how we represent that, and then that can hopefully just be plugged into any of these or any new model that somebody wants to develop, and that's really the main driving goal here. So we have our approach that we hopefully more or less understand. We have our selection of models here where we've chosen FDS. Now we want to actually set it up and run a simulation, get an answer. So we have that computational volume, and obviously we have to add in the fuel. We have to assemble those cells of vegetative fuel to make some kind of fuel layer. And a really nice thing that's coming out of this work is this kind of gold mine of remote sensing data that we have. So I stole a slide here from Mike's talk a couple months back of some of the LiDAR scans that we have of these 10 by 10 meter plots we're burning in New Jersey. And we can start to see kind of the fuel variability that we have, maybe in terms of loading in particular areas, but also different classes of fuel, maybe some thicker fuels in areas versus just needles in other areas. And because we have this three-dimensional domain, we can kind of plug this information into our grid cells as we go and directly populate that same spatial variability into our model. So that's been a really nice thing that's coming out of this project, is how best to go about this kind of communication between our remote sensing data and our modeling. Another way to look at this is in terms of kind of building a synthetic vegetation layer, if you want. And again, I took a little bit from Mike's presentation where he talked about developing a library of fuels with all this remote sensing data. So if they are able to scan different shrubs, for example, at different times since a fire, you can kind of characterize what a shrub might look like 3 years after a fire of a particular species. And from that, we can have some average properties and maybe some randomness about it that we add empirically based on all these scans. And we can use that to just kind of make a shrub, a sort of quasi-random shrub that we populate into our model. And then we can do this many times, and in this way we're sort of building up what a fuel layer might look like for these shrubs, say 3 years after a fire. Of course, this is just an illustrative example. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand exactly the allometric models of these shrubs or what they should look like based on this remote sensing data. But you sort of get an idea of how this library of remote sensing vegetation types could be really useful for modeling. And then we have to go one step further, and again, this is just illustrative, but because we have these discrete grid cells and we're not looking at all of the fine structure of these fuels, we have to kind of lump the amount of biomass that we have in each of our grid cells, whatever size that we end up choosing for them, and we end up with this more pixelated or rasterized description, but we're still capturing a lot of that spatial variability that we might have. And this can be useful not just for the detailed physics-based approach, but any other type of model that allows you to input spatial variability in something like fuel loading or moisture or whatever. So that's the fuel aspect and some of the considerations there. Of course, the other thing that's important for setting up a model like this is looking at the weather, in particular the wind. So we have to apply some boundary conditions on the outside of our whole domain in order to drive the flow, but we also have to be able to represent what is the effects that that vegetation that we put in have on the flow. So in this example, this is some ongoing work looking at the canopy structure in that plantation in New Jersey. So we have some LiDAR data available that gives us an idea of the canopy bulk density. And you see we have this pretty dense fuel layer at an elevated height and then kind of a sub-canopy space here. And we're looking at, if we put this into our model, we assemble our layer of fuel from all those cells, are we able to simulate the vertical profile of the wind velocity to an accurate enough degree? In particular, we're looking at kind of this lower region below the canopy because we are dealing with quite low intensity fires, very small flame heights. So it's really important that we capture the near surface winds because that's what's going to be driving the fire behavior that we encounter. So this is a big question. Are we able to get the effect of the canopy above on the surface winds in order to have a good simulation? And if we're having difficulties here, then it's tough to put a lot of confidence in anything that we do after. So this is a really important step. Now, again, we also have a gold mine of data on the meteorology side. If you saw Ken talk, he described all of the instrumentation that's gone out into these 10 by 10 plots, particularly these 16 3D sonic anemometers. So we've been really lucky in having quite a nice characterization of what the wind looks like even before a fire scenario in terms of flow in this environment. So we can really do some of that testing that I talked about and interrogate the capabilities of our model. So let's say we've done that. We've got our fuel put into the model. We've got our wind simulated the way that it ought to be. Now we can set off a fire and let it spread. And this, again, is just a kind of qualitative example actually from some work I did in my thesis looking at some more intense head fire behavior also in the Pine Barrens. And just an example of how we're able to look at the progression of our simulated fire front in blue versus some experimental observations of how quickly an actual fire spread in this environment. So you can get an idea of just sort of what this looks like and some of the things that we're able to output from it. And in terms of trying to do this on the 10 by 10 meter plots, to wear out the term gold mine, we have just a ton of data on the behavior side as well. So Ken showed some nice pictures from downward-facing IR camera that we have. So we're able to get a really nice reconstruction of how the fire spread and what the shape looked like so that we can directly compare that to the evolution that we predict with our simulation. But we also have some more detailed measurements in terms of the actual processes that are driving the fire behavior. So an example here being temperature measurements that were made close to the fuel layer and a meter above the fuel layer, and how those differ due to the flame structure and the plume structure. And hopefully we're able to capture similar things when we go and model this, and it's a great way to test on a little bit more of a physical basis really what our model is predicting and how accurate it is, because it's quite possible to predict the right spread rate, but have all of these details of the physics actually be wrong. So that's something that we have to be conscious of looking at our outputs across all of these different scales. So what's the problem here? I mean, it seems like we can set up our model and run it, and we have all of this nice data to compare it to. Well, again, going back to the work I did in my thesis, we discovered that, well, we can do a simulation of certain scenarios. We have quite a lot of under-resolved phenomena or parts of the physics which haven't been described very well, and this can lead to quite a bit of sensitivity in the output results that we predict. So an example being changing the drag coefficient of the canopy between values that we might expect from literature. We get a pretty significant change, around 40% on the predicted spread rate. So we have some significant sensitivity here, and this is in the case of, as I said, moderate to high intensity fires. Now we're going to the case of much lower intensity fires where we have smaller flames and potentially much more sensitivity to things like local variations in the fuel structure or the moisture or changes in the weather conditions. So everything becomes just a little bit more sensitive, a bit more difficult to handle. So we really have to be confident in the physics we have. And this is why we're not just forging ahead, but instead we're going down to the laboratory scale to try to pin some of these things down. So an example I have here is some flame spread testing in a fuel bed done at Edinburgh. And this is Rory presented this stuff a couple of webinars ago, and our PhD student here, Zach, has done a lot of really nice work looking at the effects of different fuel bed structures. And the nice thing here is that we can really manipulate what the fuel bed looks like, and we can do a lot of repetitions and make some really detailed measurements that we need to test our model. But I have simple in quotes here because it may seem simple, but we still have quite a lot going on. So we have driving our fire spread, some radiation from the flames, but also from within the fuel bed where we have hot fuel particles, hot pine needles in this case, which may be smoldering, and that's going to add to our radiation ahead of the fire front. We also have some effects of convection, where the natural buoyancy of our fire will draw in some of the ambient air from both sides here, and that's going to change potentially some aspects of the fire spread and also the smoldering behavior behind it. And on that point, in terms of combustion processes, we also have to deal with the flaming combustion, but the smoldering combustion. And all of these things kind of link together, and it becomes actually quite a complicated scenario, even though it seems simple if we're going to capture all of these physics. But it does make a really nice test case for us. So here's an example. I've been working on just kind of doing a one-to-one, if you will, simulation of some different fuel beds on that table. And we can look at some general outputs. So in the experiment, we have the table on a load cell, so we can look at the rate of mass loss, which is related to the energy release or the fire line intensity, if you're more familiar with that. And so it's a good kind of global metric for our fire behavior, and we want to be capturing that if we hope to be reproducing the same thing with our simulation. And you can see an example here on the right. We have some overall maybe decent consistency, but we do have a tendency to overpredict for these particular conditions, this particular fuel bed. We're overpredicting the mass loss rate, so the energy release. So we might have a bit of an issue here, but this kind of global output variable doesn't do much more for us than tell us that we have an issue. We need to figure out what's going on. So we need to dive a little bit deeper, and that's where the ability to do some of these detailed diagnostic measurements comes in handy. So we've put some flow sensors into the fuel bed to look at things like the velocity around the flame front. And here's a comparison, again, between one of the experiments and the model, showing when you have negative flow, you have flow coming from right to left here. And when you have positive flow, it's coming from left to right. So basically what we're seeing is first the entrainment flow ahead of the fire front where the probe is. The fire passes by, and now we have entrainment flow coming behind the fire front. So we are able to capture that shift in behavior with the model, the same that we see in the experiments. We do get some differences, though, maybe in the intensity of the flow in terms of both the entrainment peaks, but also this kind of prolonged period of entrainment flow that we have after the fire passes in the experiments, but the model shows that flow dampening out quite quickly. So that can affect certain things like our prediction of the smoldering fire behavior. So we've started to see some more details about the model and where we might have some limitations here. We can also use simulations like this to go a step further and look at things which actually are quite difficult, maybe even impossible to measure experimentally, but that doesn't mean they're not valuable. So in this instance, we've looked at basically one of those grid cells of the vegetation as the fire passes, and we're looking at the mass that's included in that grid cell in terms of the vegetation. So we have some water mass in blue, and as the temperature, the dashed line, starts to increase, we lose that moisture. As you'd expect, it starts drying. Then we reach a certain temperature, and the actual biomass the solid mass starts to go away from the solid phase as we're producing volatiles through pyrolysis. And then some of this gets converted into char, and we have a little bit of a period of char oxidation here, or smoldering combustion, but we see that we produce a lot of char. We don't end up actually consuming that much. We don't have that much smoldering going on. So that already tells us, even though we don't have a direct experimental comparison, we've observed quite a lot of smoldering combustion. We already overpredicted the mass loss rate, but we're not consuming all of this char. So if we were, we ought to have even a higher mass loss rate. So maybe we do have an issue here. And these kinds of investigations into the model, if nothing else, give us really good clues of where to look when we do our experimentation of what phenomena might be interesting. Because if we have an issue here, maybe we don't really understand the dynamics that are driving our char oxidation, or we haven't done a good job modeling that, and we need to maybe get some more experimental data to improve that model. So this is a great way to kind of probe the physics and figure out where to move forward. But as I said, that's a pretty complicated scenario. There's a lot of interactions going on there. So maybe we want to go even a step further in terms of simplifying the problem. And something I've been working on recently is developing this heated wind tunnel called the WEIRD. And this allows us to impose a flow up to about 3 meters per second, and also an elevated temperature of the flow up to about 650 Celsius. So we can look at flow through different fuel beds, and we can also look at convective heating. And this might start to look like a pretty poor representation of an actual wildfire, what we see in the field, even what we see on the table. But there is a really big benefit in terms of the modeling and understanding the physics. And that's because we've simplified this scenario so much that we've actually been able to reduce basically to one equation, which says that the pressure loss, the pressure drop that we have through that wind tunnel is just going to be a function of the drag force in our fuel bed. And when we go and simulate at the large scale, that's something that we have to know, what's the drag force of our fuel bed. So this allows us to go directly to that and just investigate this one equation. And I would say don't really worry about the details of what's going on here. Just suffice it to say that we have some approach that we've taken to model the drag, which has a certain level of crudeness built into it. And so we're interested in asking how accurate is this current model that we're actually using, and do we need to improve it? So the first step would be to just directly simulate the WEIRD in that test section. And first, we're just plotting the outputs, the triangles from our simulations against this equation. Because we've reduced this whole problem down to a single equation, it's really nice. We can make sure that our model is doing what we asked it to do. Even if that's not the right physics, it's at least doing what we asked it to do. So that's the first step that we want to take here. Then we can look at our experimental results, and we see actually maybe we're not doing such a good job, particularly at a lower bulk density case like this 10 kilograms per cubic meter. Interestingly, we seem to get closer to what we expect as we increase the bulk density, so that there might be scenarios with this current model where we're doing a pretty good job. And what that means is we're actually missing some aspects, some influence of the bulk density in our current model, and we need to go back and try to include that. And this has been a really nice tool to try to improve our understanding of flow through litter layers like this. There's obviously a lot more work that needs to go on. I'd look at a much wider range of bulk densities, but also other fuel types. So we can look just at a layer of leaves or something like down woody fuels. But we can also do some combined beds and look at mixtures that are indicative of what we might find in reality, and see how that changes kind of the overall drag force. So there's quite a lot of testing that can be done in this direction. But then we want to go this step further and also look at the convective heating. So if we put our fuel into the test section and we force through high temperature flow, well, that's going to raise the temperature of our fuel as we would expect, and that process should be driven with some convective heat transfer coefficient. We should be able to use that to describe what's happening. But this is a case similar to the drag force and the drag coefficient, where we've used some rough approximation. We're not really sure how good it is. So the goal is to, again, try to do some simulations, some experiments, and see if we need to and if we can improve what we use for our convective heating model. And again, we want to look at different fuel bed types, different configurations. And we can also look at forced heating, so something similar to if smoke plume were blown through fuels or a flame was blown through fuels, but also natural cooling, where you might have radiation, something like that, heating up a fuel bed to a certain temperature, but then you have some natural convection that's occurring, kind of counteracting that. So these are kind of two different modes of convection that we're interested in looking at. And then really briefly, this last point here, I don't want to get too much into the details because this is very preliminary, but we've started also looking into the thermal degradation side of the modeling. So if we have that computational cell of vegetation and we start to raise its temperature, just like I showed in that simulation of the fuel bed, first we start to release moisture from the fuel, and that process is going to consume some energy. We then raise the temperature further, and we start to release some fuel vapor in pyrolysis. That process generally ought to also consume some energy, and then we might have the development of some char. we raise the temperature further, and this can start to oxidize in smoldering combustion. We'll consume some oxygen and produce some CO and CO2, and also some energy. So these are kind of the three main degradation processes that we want to capture in order to get our combustion and therefore our flame spread right. So this is some work that another PhD student, Carlos, has been focused on, looking at some different, more fundamental tests. For example, the thermogravimetric analysis, TGA. And in very simple terms, this lets us very slowly heat up a small sample of fuel, and we're able to, by looking at the changes in mass, pick out the temperatures at which these different processes occur. So we can see drying around 100 where we expect. But then the current model that we're using for pyrolysis is showing that this occurs at a much lower temperature, or a lower temperature than some of the experimental data. So we have some questions here about whether we need to modify what we put into the model, but we also have to be careful how well these TGA tests represent what's actually happening. We've ground up the fuel in order to run them so it looks different than the natural fuel, and we have much slower heating rates than we would in a wildfire. So there's some caution we have to apply here, and it's early days in the investigation, but this is another interesting aspect in terms of being able to model everything correctly. So the final challenge, if we look at all of that and try to improve all of that, we still have to be able to go back to the field. And here we have a bit of a scaling issue. So on the left, we show that we can, at least to some approximation, do a simulation of flame spread in the lab. And in my PhD, we looked at doing some flame spread at the field scale. But these are actually not even necessarily analogous, because on the left we have these very small flames, more representative of these operational fires, these low-intensity backing fires, whereas I said on the right, that's more of your high-intensity head fire. So just because we can do one doesn't mean we can do the other, and we have to start looking into perhaps how we can simplify some of the physics we have. If we can figure out which ones are driving the processes, driving the flame spread, maybe we can do our best to model that at the field scale with high fidelity. Maybe we don't have to focus so much on some of the other processes, because from a computational standpoint, it's just going to become very burdensome to take what's on the left and just multiply that over and over to get something as big as what's on the right. So there's some very important questions to be answered here. I think some very interesting opportunities, and that's also starting to take us in the direction of how do we reduce what we've learned from the physics-based model maybe into a more simplified tool, which is appropriate for these particular fire types. And just generally speaking, in conclusion here, the challenges ahead, you can probably guess. We need to continue to interrogate these fundamental aspects. So there's more tests to be done on the flow, also on the heat transfer, and we need to look more on the thermal degradation side of things. These are kind of the three areas where we're focused. And then we need to look more at how we can take all of this really nice data that we've gathered in the field and get some robust inputs in terms of the fuel and weather. So I talked about different approaches for building fuel layers in the model and for kind of driving the flow and making sure that that's accurate. And then, again, we have this really big challenge associated with scaling and whether we can just multiply what we have at the lab scale in our different distances, or if we have to start reducing some of the physics and simplify our description. So I guess that takes me to the end here, and it looks like we might have some time for questions.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much. That was a really good presentation. So we'll give folks a few minutes. Yeah, we'll give folks a few minutes to type questions into the chat box. We had a little bit of back and forth about one of your earlier slides. I'm not sure if the question was already answered. While we're waiting to find that out, just I guess a comment or a question about the scaling. So as you're scaling up and down through all these different scales, from the lab scale to the 10-meter scale, and eventually to the standard forest scale, do you see different elements potentially meaning more in the field, or mattering more when it gets to the operational scale?
I mean, yeah, that is a big question that's sort of been driving us all along here. And I mean, qualitatively, we can say maybe in the beginning things look similar in the lab to the field in some instances, but of course that's not enough, and it's hard to separate because it's difficult to add in all of the variability and all of the conditions that we have in the field into the lab scenario. So, I mean, we were talking earlier about the substrate that you have underneath the fuel bed and how representative that is of soil and the moisture that you might have or how cold it is. So there's all of these different aspects that kind of complicate what might be important in one scale versus another. But hopefully this is where maybe the modeling can come in, where we can add in something like a different substrate and see how much that influences the fire behavior kind of from a modeling standpoint and get some ideas from that.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Inga Lapuma is saying, you really made some sense of things for me. I'm wondering if you can imagine us working to bridge the gap from wildland to the structure world, as that seems to be a challenge for fire behavior models.
Sorry, maybe I'm not understanding. In which context are you referring to? So like wild and urban interface or just built environment?
I don't know, Inga, you can type wildland urban interface or built environment, bridging the gap from wildland to the structure world. Non-built to built.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess right now the interaction is sort of working one way in the other direction, where we've, in our approach at least, have been relying a lot on what's been done in the built environment to kind of guide how we go about this. And as I said, a lot of these tools have been built up quite a lot over the past 20 or 30 years, actually, to study things in the built environment. And now we're adding this extra level of complexity. So hopefully we can learn from them, but also maybe avoid some of the mistakes of the past. I'm not sure if that really answers your question. But.
Yeah, I wonder if Inga might have been asking if, since you've gotten some models that have gone from the built to the, to the wildland scale, and so could it go the reverse way, or are there things from your experiments that could translate to the built back to the built environment?
I mean, on a fundamental scale, at least in terms of the lab testing, there's certainly lessons that we can take away about basics of the fire behavior, about degradation of different materials, or about the flow. You can certainly have a porous material in the built environment. So as we learn how to test these things, how to understand the dynamics, that can definitely feed back the other way.
Okay, great, thank you. Oh, and just to follow up, Inga says, that makes sense. The physics should work for any fuels you investigate.
Yeah, hopefully, more or less.
Yeah, keep modeling. We had a couple more questions that have come in, and again, folks, please feel free to keep more questions. More questions are popping into the chat box. Sharon has a question. She says, Eric, what is the resolution for your WSDS simulation? How many levels do you have in the fuel layer?
So at the laboratory scale, I guess you're asking, the current investigations are all around a centimeter resolution, and we have different levels of resolution of the actual fuel layer because the studies that we're doing, we're trying to keep the same amount of fuel mass but change the bulk density. So we're basically kind of compacting the fuel bed or fluffing it up a bit, if you will. And so that if we keep the same grid resolution, we end up with varying resolution over that particular fuel layer because it can go from 3 centimeters to 6 centimeters or so. So that is something that we still need to investigate a bit more, obviously, is do some more intense grid resolution studies. But that's what we're working with at the moment.
Cool, thanks. We had another couple questions. They might be paired that came in. For the wind tunnel experiment you showed, what was the pressure sensor used to measure dP over dx? And then on a related question, I think, what was the pressure sensor's response rate? 10 hertz?
So we're using, it's just a small kind of board mount pressure transducer that is the actual response time of the instrument is quite small. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but we're sampling at 10 hertz, and that's definitely coarser than the actual response time of the pressure sensor. And we just have it connected to some static pressure taps along the length of the test section, as well as to a pitot tube to measure the velocity that is associated with a particular pressure drop.
Great, thank you. We have another question that popped in. Inga asks, do you see any promising scaling factors or methods as yet?
So, I mean, a route that I'm tempted to take, perhaps, but maybe needs a bit more thought before just diving in. For anybody familiar a bit more with FDS and WFDS, there's approaches to kind of look at the fuel layer, particularly if you just have a litter layer like this, treat it just as a boundary condition as opposed to directly resolving the thickness of the fuel and all the flow through it and everything that we're doing in the lab scale simulations. So can we reduce that and treat it more crudely? Might be one scaling method. I think this project does present a really nice opportunity to look at some of these things where we have hopefully a scale at the field that's small enough that we can do some really highly resolved simulations similar to the lab, and then we can do some reduction of the physics, some scaling methods, and have a direct comparison and be able to say, okay, this is an appropriate way to scale the phenomena, or this is not. But more to come, hopefully. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, very cool. And again, you guys are still on the early stages of this project.
Yeah.
All right. We got a thank you. Very nice talk from one person.
Thanks.
For folks out there, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. I know we've had some really good, complicated questions so far and some really good, complicated answers. So keep them coming. We have a few more minutes before the top of the hour. I think we have time for a few more questions. And also, Eric, if you have any final thoughts or comments that you want to share while folks are typing, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, just happy to answer any questions, I guess. It looks like Tim is looking forward to the papers to come. I know Rory is also looking forward to me writing some papers. So.
Nick says me too.
All right.
I guess you got a little hint there. Let's see, we'll give folks maybe another 30 seconds or so. Aha, here's a question. Tim asks, did you use any turbulence modeling in the system?
Yeah, so I mean the code is large eddy simulation, so we have a subgrid scale turbulence model built into it, which it just uses kind of, I mean, I don't know if you want the details here, but it uses sort of an algebraic approach, so we're not solving a conservation equation for our subgrid scale turbulent energy or anything like that, but we are accounting for the turbulence.
Cool. All right, we'll give folks another minute or so to type questions in the chat box. I think with this size group, we could open up the phone lines just in case there's any lingering questions out there from folks that might not be in the webinar software. All right, so if you're out there, please mute your own phone line, and I'm going to unmute the participant lines. And if anybody has any comments or questions, we have 5 more minutes that we can handle those in. So unmuting. All right, so does anybody have questions that you'd like to pose to our presenter? Silence.
Yep.
I've got a more general question, and this could be to you or to anybody else involved in the project. Thinking about applications to prescribed fire versus wildfire. While you've been out there burning or in the lab burning, do you have any thoughts on applications of the models that you're developing to prescribed fire versus wildfire?
Yeah, I mean, I think a potential direction to go in is really related to this to the fuel side of things. So on maybe on the wildfire side, you're more interested in the existing fuel structure and how that's going to affect the fire behavior. But on the prescribed fire side, and something we tried to look at already a bit with my thesis work, is then what is the subsequent result on the fuel structure. So you have to really be confident in your ability to model that consumption, whether it's the flaming or smoldering fuel consumption, to try to get an idea of sort of the effect in the three-dimensional structure of the fuel layer, where you might target ladder fuels with a certain fire behavior or burning under certain conditions, and you might get more crown involvement in other conditions. So I think there's the potential to do some interesting targeted studies there.
Very cool. Thanks. Anybody else out there
wants to chime in?
Yeah, if anybody else wants to chime in, you've got a couple more minutes. All right, well, maybe you've answered everybody's questions. If anybody has questions, then we should have contact info for all of our presenters on the NAFC website in some form or other. Again, Eric we just produced a research brief based on a paper that Eric wrote on this and related studies. So definitely check us out on firesciencenorthatlantic.org, and also stay tuned in another 2 weeks. We've got our final webinar in this startup series. So Eric, thanks again so much for presenting. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope you have a really good rest of your day and really great webinar. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right, take care everybody.
Yep, take care. Bye.